Mike Costello, and I'm with the Reverend Iris Freelander, and today we'd like to talk to you about the concept of heaven. Depending upon your religious background or your faith tradition, you probably have some preconceived ideas about what heaven is. Our fellowship is a New Thought Christian church, and in the New Thought or metaphysical movement, there are many new and different interpretations to theological beliefs and understanding. And so we're going to be sharing with you some of our thoughts and ideas about heaven and what it is and whether it is a place or whether it is something else. And so we'd like to begin by talking about what is heaven? Is it a thing or a place, or is it something else, Iris?
Or is it a state of mind? Well, heaven is right here on earth. We know that, and that's a trite thing to say, but we know that it is. Heaven is what we make it to be. And of course, we do go to a different dimension when we die, and that would be heaven or who knows what.
Mm-hmm. And that who knows what is the other aspect, which is often when we talk about heaven, we also have to talk about hell, because people in their theological upbringing have a belief system in both of those places as separate and distinct. But one of the things that we believe in New Thought is that we live in our minds as much or more than we live in the world. And so we talk about the idea that we have heavenly states of consciousness and we have hellish states of consciousness, and those happen to us right here in this present moment.
Yes, and we know that that is true. And it says in the Bible, heaven is where we are. And so we know that heaven is a state of mind, and heaven is what we make it to be. We can make hell for ourselves, or we can make heaven for ourselves. It doesn't matter our state of health. It doesn't matter a lot of things. It just matters where we're coming from inside ourselves.
And that happens in us, in our mind, doesn't it?
Yes, yes. And it's so important that we keep a higher state of mind and stay spiritually oriented. I know it's hard to stay attuned to God, Creator God, but if we can, then we're more or less in a state of heaven right here on earth. And a lot of people would scoff at that, but it's not impossible at all, because when we meditate, we're tuning to God's own energy. So we can, throughout the day, reattune ourselves, and that makes a big difference in our lives. And it does give us a heavenly state of being.
Let's talk a little bit about how people can come into this heavenly state of being. Of course, we begin by training our conscious mind to be cautious of negative thoughts, but meditation or prayer is a good vehicle to begin to change our consciousness, isn't it?
Yes, indeed, because then prayer is when we're talking to God, and meditation is when we're listening, and we need to do both. And we also achieve a different frame of mind, a different state of consciousness when we do that. And so it's that state of consciousness that is either heaven or hell. It's that state of consciousness that makes us be whatever it is we are in whatever state we're in. However, you and I both know that on the inner planes, there are different dimensions, different levels of consciousness on the inner planes. And we, of course, are living in the third dimension, and so the next is the fourth dimension. And we have lots of information on the fourth dimension from those who have had near-death experiences, as you well know. And it's such a wonderful thing that we have access to that information. And that young man, Matthew Ward, who channels information through his mother, Susie Ward, and she's written a book, Within and Beyond, of his information that he's given. Well, he talks about the various levels of consciousness on the inner planes, and I don't think he phrases it like that, but he talks about the different people who want to send messages to their friends and family here on earth. And one man, for example, couldn't get his information to Matthew because he wasn't able to Matthew wasn't able to attune himself to that man's energy, because the man was in a state of what a lot of people would call hell, but we would just say it would be a lower state of consciousness. And so because he was in that state of consciousness, he couldn't attune to Matthew, Matthew couldn't attune to him. But Matthew got help from other beings on the inner, and they helped with their energy, helped to attune. And then the man was able to send messages. And one thing he said is he's very sorry he lived the life he did here on earth, because he was a very worthless, shiftless person, that's his words, who didn't take care of his family, again, his words. And so that made a big difference on the inner, but it left it open for one to believe that he was in that state because he put himself in that state of consciousness. God didn't do it.
Right. God's will for us never changes, and we've talked about
Yeah.
that. And so, this idea that God is going to send us to either heaven or hell, really, from our standpoint, is a misunderstanding of
Exactly.
truth. And truth is that God is always going to embrace us and welcome us. And I think it's important also for us to mention that when we talk about heavenly states of consciousness and being able to be in heaven on earth and also to be in hellish experiences on earth, we're not talking about or we're not saying that there is not heaven in the afterlife, nor are we saying
Exactly.
at all that there is not an afterlife.
Yeah.
And so often traditional believers will say, well, if you're telling people to be in a heavenly state of consciousness and be in heaven during their lifetime, you're really shortchanging the theological truth, because the only place that you can be in heaven is when you're dead and in heaven.
Yes.
And that, of course, is one of the differences between New Thought and traditional faiths, because many traditional Christian churches teach that we have to wait until after we die to receive the rewards and the peace and all of the good things that come from heaven. And what we're saying is that we have the ability to have those good things after this life, and certainly our life goes on, but we also have the ability to have that heaven on earth in this life experience, and we don't have to wait to die for the good things to happen. That good things can happen to us while we're here on earth, and as good things happen to us, we become more attuned to the reality of heaven here, and we become attuned and prepared for heaven in the hereafter.
And that's the ideal, because a lot of people live in two worlds simultaneously, this earthly world and the inner. And so if we can do that and do it and still keep our feet on the ground, then that's a wonderful thing, because it's marvelous practice for when we do go over. And I'm just so grateful for the wonderful books and information that's available to us that others have brought through. And many of those books have no conflict at all. They just show that we're in different areas. And one interesting thing is that the books point out that there are different areas in heaven, if you will, that as there are different areas on earth. And that makes sense too, because not everyone is going to the same state of consciousness, to the same place.
But the important thing is that we all continue to be. So our existence goes on.
Exactly.
And with our existence goes our consciousness.
Yeah.
And so often in funeral services, and just last Saturday I officiated at a funeral, and one of the things that I always tell people at funerals is to believe that your loved one is conscious and aware, just as you are conscious and aware. And so as they are conscious and aware, there is the ability for you to send thoughts to them. And if your thoughts are aligned with their thoughts, they're now on the inner, they've now progressed to another state of life and being. But in order to maintain contact with that invisible side of life and to receive the goodness and guidance and direction from it, and also the guidance and direction that we get from God, we need to be in a state of consciousness that's receptive, that allows that information to come back and forth.
Yes, and then we can intuitively attune to our loved ones on the inner planes when we are able to achieve that state of consciousness. And that's a very wonderful thing to know, and a marvelous promise. And a lot of people I know from the traditional spiritual faith think that we wait until the judgment day and then we don't have any consciousness until that time, which really doesn't make sense to me. And it didn't make sense to me when I was a very small child. And I started believing in reincarnation when I was like 5 or 7 years old, because I saw a young playmate of mine in his coffin, and I thought it couldn't possibly be that way, because if God is love, then how can he not know why would that young boy lose all consciousness of anything until who knows when the judgment day is going to be? So and then I formed an idea of this reasonable facsimile of reincarnation at that time. But I think that some of us stay more attuned to divine energy, to the inner planes of being, to where we came from. And there's that trailing clouds of glory as they come. Well, some of us stay more attuned, and so we stay in touch more fully.
And those who stay in touch, and if we just think about people in our own lives who are always seemingly centered, always at peace, who always have that heavenly state of consciousness, they're able to maintain that connectiveness with the unseen forces of life, and with the presence of God, and with all of those powers and principalities that help us from the other side. And they're able to constantly access that information. And I think it's important to talk to those who are listening about the fact that we're not talking about anything that is kind of hocus pocus,
Yes.
or the kinds of things that we think that people often associate with this idea of spirituality at all. We're talking about a very conscious way of living and going about our daily life in a state of awareness and consciousness that is centered in peace and is unified with the presence and the power of God.
That is the important part, knowing that we are unified, as you just said, with the presence and power of God. If we can maintain that state of consciousness, we can face anything that Earth has to offer, because we know that Earth is a testing ground, and we're here as a school. And so of course we're learning. We wouldn't need to be here if we didn't need to learn lessons. So if we can maintain that conscious centering, then we can face any adversity.
Yeah, we actually move into that heavenly state, or as the Bible says so eloquently, Christ Jesus spoke of the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of God. And the kingdom of heaven, as he spoke about it, related to a place that we go in mind.
Yes.
And it related as well to a place that we go in the physical form, in an unseen realm that is at some point in time in our life. But the real issues of the kingdom, when his kingdom teaching was brought so clearly in the Gospels, he talks about the kingdom, the kingdom, the kingdom, and he talks about this kingdom of God and this kingdom of heaven. And we can always see the correlation of the two, and the fact that heaven is always a state of consciousness. And in his own words, he revealed the fact, the reality, that the kingdom is within.
Right.
And so heaven is with us at this moment, and heaven goes with us as we move into the next realm of life and experience. An important aspect, I think, is when we talk about what New Thought is about and what metaphysical philosophy, metaphysical Christian philosophy is about, we can draw upon the resources of Christian Science and also religious science, where those two organizations have done so much to promote the concept of divine mind, or the mind of God, getting unified or connected with our human mind, our conscious mind. And when we can get our mind aligned with the divine mind of God, we're not talking about the brain of God and our brain. We're talking about the dynamic of consciousness and our mind with divine mind. And then when that's united, divine mind continues to feed us what we need in terms of guidance and direction and peace and prosperity and health and all of the abundant things that Christ Jesus himself talked about.
Yes. And if we can remember those facts, if we can remember those truths, then we can face whatever adversity is brought our way. And also we can be an inspiration to others. And we also are able to go out in full consciousness when we do go out in death, in the transition time. Then we can go ever so much more happily and fully. And again, we have proof of that. We know intuitively that's true, but we have proof of that from those who have come back and given their reports.
The value of being conscious in the moment and being conscious in the transition. Now, for many people, that's probably something that they have not thought much about.
Yes.
But the value, and of course, one of the wonderful things that Eastern faith traditions have brought us, Buddhism, especially Hinduism, have brought us the teaching or the important mindset that being conscious of that death experience, or being conscious during that death experience, which is not death at all,
Yes.
is so eminently important. Now, let's talk about that. What is it that, what information have we been given about those who pass from this physical life into the next and are conscious of it, from this heaven into the next heaven?
Well, different ones have come back and reported that it was so much easier for them to go if the family was not grieving and holding them back. And they've complained that the family did hold them back and wished that they hadn't, and wanted them to release, to not grieve so much. And it's impossible to not grieve when someone we love goes. But if we have a strong faith and we know that they're in a better place, then it's easier to release them. But it's impossible to not grieve. But I think that over much grieving is sometimes a pseudo, and they do it deliberately, and then they get carried out along with their grief. And I know I've seen that happen in the country where I used to live. And so it's all in our own minds. It's whatever we decide. And I know that when people lose someone they love in death, that it's impossible not to grieve to a point. But it is possible to remember that with God all things are possible, and then go along on that premise. And I know I lived through the sudden death of my daughter, and it was a impossible situation for me. But the only thing that sustained me was my faith. And so, and I know that's true of many other people too. Another example in that way is when my Aunt Florence died, and she went out so happily and freely. And the mortician said, your aunt is so beautiful. She is, and she was an 80-year-old lady who had been racked by illness for 4 years. She had had a heart bypass surgery, had cancer. She had been bleeding profusely. I mean, she really had a rough time physically, but yet she did have an aura of beauty because she went so peacefully and happily.
And her experience was a peaceful one.
Right.
Yeah.
It was. And then she came back through a psychic medium who was able to bring information from her, and it was conclusively her. She had I transcribed that information. There was 4 pages of information that she gave, and she talked about things that were not in my mind at the time we were there, and things that the medium had no knowledge of. So it was obviously my aunt who was talking and giving family information, and also information of things she had seen. One interesting thing she said is the Blessed Mother comes from time to time. And she said the lady in the pink dress comes. And I didn't know who that was. And I said, am I supposed to give a message to someone in the pink dress? And she said, no. And so I called my other aunt and asked her who it might be. And she said, oh, there was a picture of the Blessed Mother on a stairwell. And she used to sit and look at that. But I knew that it was the Blessed Mother because before the session ended, she said that sometimes she comes, Jesus comes with her, and always angels come with her. So I said, oh, that's the Blessed Mother. And she said, yeah.
And that state of consciousness was maintained to help her in that transition to the next life.
That's correct. Now, it had been 4 months from the time she died in her physical body until she came back in that way. But many people, I understand from what I've read, are not able to come back even for a year or for quite a long time. It depends on their state of consciousness when they go over. It depends on if they're resisting death. And it depends on if the grief is too heavily laden with energy that the family and friends are feeling, then it holds them back.
Isn't it true, though, that everything in life and everything in our spiritual life and in our physical life is determined by our mind?
Exactly.
By the consciousness and the level of consciousness, and whether our consciousness is centered, which we talk about so often, and united and aligned with the power and the presence of God, or whether it's affected by the circumstances and situations. So you just spoke about your aunt who passed away in a very peaceful state, and yet we all know of people who do not pass away peacefully because their state of consciousness is such that it's in such turmoil and such denial and such confusion. And then aside from the death experience, we have all kinds of experiences in our daily lives that create the same kind of turmoil that keep us from a peaceful and heavenly state of consciousness.
Yes, exactly. That is such a wonderful point. And also, when people are ill, if they fight the illness, the doctors have proved this to be true, and everyone knows that it's true, but except for certain sick people who don't abide by it, but the more they give in to the pain and release themselves to the pain, the more the pain occurs. And the more they can just rise above the pain. And a lot of people who are in a lot of pain would say, well, that's not possible. And I agree. Sometimes for certain people it might not be possible. But if it is at all possible, that's the best favor they can ever do themselves, anyone who is experiencing pain and illness, because that holds them back ever so much more. And also, their attitude creates the pain. And I saw that in a husband and a friend of mine whose wife needed my help at night sometimes to be with her husband, and he was resisting his illness so much. He was a doctor and thought he would never be in that position, but he was, and he resisted it so strongly. And so it was impressed on my consciousness then how the state of mind we're in changes the state of the pain we're feeling. Of course, Dr. Simonton proved that in all his research work.
But struggle always compounds the problem.
Yes.
Isn't that true?
Yes.
Struggle and strife create, it doesn't matter whether it's a family or an individual or a household or a nation. When fighting comes and struggle comes and we resist what is, then that which we resist is more dominant and more powerful in our lives. And the other thing, just as we read in the book of Job and the story that that book brings to us, as Job said, that which I have feared has come upon me.
Yes,
And so as we fear these things and as we build upon them, they rob us of this kingdom of heaven.
exactly, exactly. And one way they rob us is we lock, our energies lock. Because if we, for example, if we're rushing too fast, if we're rushed and fearful at the same time, if we're combining negative emotions and it gets over much, then we can't think. So we lock, our whole consciousness just locks up, which is another proof that this is, that the more we're able to relax and just flow with life, then the more we're able to achieve a heavenly state of consciousness.
Back in that story of Job that I made reference to just as you were speaking, I'm reminded that in Job, in all of his suffering, and as he was losing all of his family and health and all wealth and all of the other things, there came a whirlwind. And in that whirlwind, there was such confusion. And our thoughts so often, and of course, that's what we believe that story to be, is
Yeah.
symbolic. And that the whirlwind in Job's story is symbolic of what happens to us in our minds when we become so negatively engulfed and we begin to believe, and then our minds are so confused and they're flying like a
Yes.
whirlwind,
Yes.
just going in a circle. And of course, as that circle continues, our emotions and our feelings are drawn down into that depression. And so things just get worse and worse, and we move into a hellish state of
Yes.
consciousness. And we're robbed of that kingdom of heaven and
Yes.
that consciousness, that mindset. And of course, what all of us want is to be at peace and
Yes.
to have the turmoil and the strife in our lives end. But it's very difficult sometimes.
Well, it is difficult, but it's not impossible at all. And again, just deep breathing is a good step toward that. Just to sit and breathe deeply through our nostrils and exhale it through our mouth. And we can exhale any way we like, but that seems to do something to our energy level. We've discovered that through meditation. And when we deliberately do that, it relaxes us. Then, when we deliberately center ourselves to God's energy, then we're able to center more easily. And so those two things are would be the first things we do toward achieving that state of consciousness.
And so as we do those things, as we begin to be conscious of our meditation life and of our emotional life and of our spiritual life, then we're able to set the stage or to begin the process of conditioning or controlling our way of thought, our way of
Yes.
thinking, so that we can dwell in the kingdom of heaven all of the time.
Exactly. And we do have control over our own lives. We do have control over our own thoughts. And we have but to work with ourselves, work in that way.
But we need to be vigilant, don't we?
Yes.
And we need also to observe how it is the dynamic of our mind operates, because so many of us are negative and we have become negative. I almost said we're negative so many of us are negative by nature, which is not true. So many of us have become negative by nature.
Yes.
But in fact, we're not designed to be negative.
That's correct. And again, it's our choice and it's up to us. And we can look at the dark side of life or we can look at the bright side of life. And another way we can attune ourselves is through songs, just to remember an inspiring song. And
songs, poetry,
yes.
readings, just anything that can bring us back to a place of heavenly consciousness or
Yes.
awareness and deny the fact that those negative influences are real in our lives.
Yes, yes. And accepting the fact that, yes, they do happen to us, but we have control over them. And if we have control over them and know that we have control over them, then they don't bring on the fear, because it's the fear of the unknown. It's fear that causes people to lock into negative thoughts. Don't you think so?
Absolutely. And fear just paralyzes us.
Yes.
And in most cases, the things that we fear never come to pass.
Yes.
But sometimes they do. But often we have fears that are never realized, and they keep us from our peaceful state of consciousness. And so we really need to be vigilant about that. And we need to be cautious about how it is we're thinking and what dynamic it is that we're allowing to operate in our lives, because we can be in a hellish state of consciousness or in a kingdom of hell all of the time or a good deal of the time. And many people are suffering that now.
Yes. And the people we see who are in that state of consciousness are those who are not judgmental. They don't complain. They try to help others when they can, but they mind their own business. They don't help others overmuch by intruding on other people's lives. And they're just very simple, basic rules of etiquette. in fact.
Of heavenly life.
Yes.
Of heavenly life. And there are people who experience that all of the time.
Yes. That young man, Matthew, who channels information to his mother, said that on the where he is, he calls it nirvana, that they don't have to be extra nice to everyone. They just have to be cordial and polite. I think that's exciting.
If we could be cordial and polite and not let people influence us to the extent
Exactly.
that they normally do.
Exactly. So they're not responsible for other people, and they're only responsible for being cordial and polite. So they don't like have to reach out to other people in a which would really be in a fickle way, wouldn't it be?
It would. And we don't need to allow the circumstances and situations or the actions of other people to influence the way that we think. We
Yes.
can think whatever we want.
Exactly.
And it's always our choice to be in that heavenly state of consciousness and to be centered no matter what people do around us or to us.
That's exactly true, because we're responsible for ourselves, not for others. And if we can just remember that and feel our own connection with God's own energy, then we can just not be concerned about other people.
But we always need to be concerned about ourselves.
Yes, 100%. And be diligent, be upstanding, be attuned, and know our place, know that we are a part of God, the whole.
And seek out our ability to be in a consciousness of heaven at all times. And we've been talking to you in the last few minutes about the kingdom of heaven. Maybe you have a different idea about what heaven is, and we're not talking to you about changing that idea, but what we are suggesting is that by changing the way that you think, you can be in the kingdom of heaven at any time in this physical life or beyond. And that's a promise that we believe to be absolutely and positively true. We hope that the information that we've shared with you has been useful. We look forward to seeing you next time.
Confident living, banner of might, comes from the Spirit with glorious light. Confident living cleanses my soul, giving the Spirit fullest control. Confident living rights every wrong. Dynamic power helps me be strong. Confident living comforts my heart from such a blessing.